Good morning and good afternoon. And as Kim said, folks are still coming in. Good evening. Habari za asubuhi, habari za leo for our friends from Kenya. My name is Will Postma. As Kim has said, I'm the Executive Director at the Primates World Relief and Development Fund, PWRDF. PWRDF, as some of you, many of you may know, is the International Humanitarian and Development Agency of the Anglican Church of Canada, working with local partners around the world, including here in Canada, focusing on human rights, health, gender equality, and food security. It's International Development Week in Canada, a time when we, together with other civil society organizations, the private sector, and government, shine a spotlight on the importance of strengthening our commitment to create a fair world for all. The theme for this year's International Development Week is to go for the goals, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, with a focus on gender equality, health, and climate action. The COVID-19 pandemic has put up so many barriers to achieving these goals. This past year, nonetheless, emphasizes just how important it is to collaborate, to move forward together, and for us working in and committed to humanitarian and development work to stay focused on the most vulnerable communities. For this panel conversation, food security in the time of COVID-19, and with the many organizers and participants of this International Development Week here in Canada, our goal is a world where no one goes hungry, where no one feels unsafe, and where no one is left behind. Our vision, PWRDF's vision, indeed is for a truly just, healthy, and peaceful world. The moderator for this conversation is Mike McKenzie. So pleased. Mike lives in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. He's a communications professional working for a post-secondary institution. Mike is a member of the PWRDF Youth Council. He's also a member of our board of directors and on our executive committee of our board as well. I'm so pleased that Mike can moderate this conversation. Thank you to everyone once again for joining this panel on such an important topic. And I now would like to turn it over to Mike to introduce our panelists. So Mike.
Thank you, Will, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to have everyone with us today. My name is Mike McKenzie, and as Will said, I'm the moderator for this discussion. I'm here today in the context as a volunteer with PWRDF. I am a member of the Primates World Relief and Development Fund Youth Council and a member of the Board of Directors, the Youth Council liaison to the board, as Will has already said. And I'm so very pleased to have been asked and to have the privilege to moderate this very important discussion with three fantastic panelists that are going to be touching on a really key issue, food security, at a really intense and challenging time in the time of COVID-19 in our world history. So a very important discussion that's taking place today. I just also want to say a bit of housekeeping of my own at the outset. I'm joining everyone today from Nova Scotia, where we had 45 centimeters of snow last night. So we're all digging out a little bit. If my internet is a little crunchy or a little wonky, that's probably why. So we did a test earlier today and everything seemed to be functioning fine. Hopefully that stays that way. But if I start to get a little wonky, I just ask for your patience and hopefully things will sort themselves out. Just to give a little bit of information about how this will go today. So we have three panelists that I will introduce in a moment. Each panelist will speak on a few different questions that we've prepared for approximately 15 minutes, maybe a few more. And then each panelist will speak, and at the end of all of the comments, we'll move to a time for question and answer. And as Kim said at the outset, we're asking everyone to make use of the chat box function in Zoom. We are almost at 90 participants, potentially with more to come. So there's simply too many folks to be able to use the hand raised function or to be able to verbally share our questions out loud. So we ask that you do make use of that chat function. Feel free to put in a question if you have it and you don't want to lose it, and the team will do their best to stay on top of it, or you can hold your questions until we're in that Q&A time. But regardless of how you choose to do it, that is the process that we're using today. So please do take note of that. So without any further ado, I will give a just very high-level introduction of our three panelists, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in depth before they each speak. But we're very pleased today to be joined by Andy Harrington, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, Kevin Munini-Kamuya, who is the CEO of the Utooni Development Organization, and Dr. Agnes Aboom, who is the Central Committee Moderator from the World Council of Churches. So we've got a very broad and diverse group of experts who are able to speak about kind of macro and micro levels of food security and some of the challenges that are being faced in the time of COVID-19. So it absolutely promises to be a great discussion. We've asked the panelists to speak broadly to 3 questions, and they're each going to approach these questions within their own the particularities of their own context. So the 3 questions are: 1 year into this global pandemic, how has COVID-19 impacted the way you and your organization carry out your development work, both in terms of challenges and opportunities? And also, how has food security been impacted by COVID-19 at various levels, local, national, and international? And then finally, are there lessons learned from this past year that all of us, partners in Canada, partners in Kenya, partners in other places of the world, need to pay attention to regarding the future of development work, and in particular, our ongoing work on the topic of food security? So we're gonna get things rolling today with Andy Harrington, who, as I've mentioned, is the Executive Director of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. He is joining us today from the mountains outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. It's an early start for him, so we're appreciative that he is jumping on this call and preparing to speak at 8 a.m. Pacific time. So without any further ado, I will pass the microphone over to Andy. Andy. Oh, and sorry, I'm supposed to talk. Sorry, Andy, I'm supposed to talk a little bit more about you. So, as I did mention, Andy is the Executive Director of Foodgrains Bank. So for those on the call who may not be familiar with Canadian Foodgrains Bank, they partner with locally based organizations in majority world countries, and the Foodgrains Bank seeks to meet emergency food needs in crisis situations. And Andy himself has more than 32 years of experience working in international development and with youth and young adults around the world. And prior to joining the Foodgrains Bank, he was the CEO of the Wellspring Foundation for Education, which is an organization that has a mission to transform education in Africa and to foster vibrant communities that address poverty in all of its forms. Andy.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's good to get an extended introduction there. It's a great privilege to be with you all this morning. PWRDF is one of our key members, and it's a joy to join with those of you, not only across the country, but across the world. And in fact, I am looking forward to hearing from my other panelists that are working alongside us today to hear their stories as well. So a little bit about us. I believe we have a PowerPoint that is going to be shared. If you could share that would be wonderful. Thank you. A little bit about Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Our mission is that we are working together to end global hunger. So as Mike mentioned, we are a conglomeration of 15 member agencies. And those 15 member agencies come together across the world to really work to see a world without hunger. It is a great thing to be able to be working ecumenically. So alongside this wonderful organization of PWRDF, we have people from denominations from across Canada. And the wonderful thing is we can unite together, put all of our differences aside and come together in the fact that we believe that God desires to see no one go hungry. So that's our work. A little bit, I'd like to really dive in a little bit on this whole question of what has happened to food security in this time of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic is primarily a health crisis, as we know. We see that on our news every day. I watch it from my home country of the UK. As you can probably tell, I'm not from around these parts, although I do have a Canadian passport. The pandemic has struck in the most awful way in terms of the people that we have lost and the damage we have seen to our health structures and health systems across the way. So it's a health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. And that economic crisis has affected food security right across the world, but particularly within poorer countries. So let's say a little bit about those impacts on the food system. Well, like Canadian farms, most farms in the majority world countries are family-run businesses. It just, they happen to mostly be a lot smaller. And so the pandemic has had relatively little impact on the farming level activities around the world. The trouble has been the breakdown of the systems that get that food to market, or actually allow that food to be planted in the first place. Some farms have had trouble getting seeds because transport was disrupted, or lacking workers as laborers couldn't travel because the lockdowns have happened right across the world. Once farmers have harvested their crops, assuming they could, or once they've got livestock ready to get to market, they've often encountered problems with transport, processing, and storage. And as you can imagine, in some of the countries we're working in, they don't have access to the transportation and storage infrastructure, particularly the freezing infrastructure that some of us have in our countries. Trucking has slowed or completely stopped in many of those countries. It's left perishable foods like fruit, dairy, and fish to spoil. So that's meant food waste has skyrocketed. And in the early days of the pandemic, even as urban consumers were complaining of empty markets, food was piling up on farms and spoiling. Now, all this affected not only the farmers' incomes, but it also affected food prices, which shot up, and the availability of food to consumers. So that's meant that food assistance from governments, from UN, from agencies like the World Food Programme, and from NGOs who are focused on food security, like the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, that's where we've come in and helped. But even that has been a problem because that's just been disrupted by higher prices, transport issues, and health risks when we try and distribute the food ourselves. It's not just been about food security, though. The pandemic has had impacts on consumers, on schools, and even on gender. People who lost their jobs shifted to cheaper staples like rice and maize and beans. And this shift in demand has rippled right back to the farms. Farmers were left trying to figure out, what can I grow? What can I sell? How do I need to change the things that my family may have farmed for decades or generations? Even if they could farm, for those of us here who've traveled to poorer countries, you'll know that food markets are essential. So many food markets actually reduced their hours, or they limited the number of people who could enter. And that, along with the sometimes aggressive enforcement of curfews, reduced people's ability to buy food and reduced earnings for farmers and market vendors themselves. So as you can see, there's a whole ripple effect right down this chain in terms of the food supply. And that meant that families had to cut back on vegetables and animal products. And we could see nutritional impacts that could last for many years, possibly decades, in stunted children and higher susceptibility to disease. See, most countries don't have the kind of social safety nets that Canada has. They can't borrow deeply like we can to help support people affected by the pandemic. They don't have the ability to subsidize wages like we do, or to give social benefits like we do. Mike mentioned I used to work for an education foundation, and I can tell you that about 1.5 billion kids have missed out on education across the world as COVID has closed schools. And many of those don't have access to online learning. A little personal story, when the pandemic hit, I was actually traveling in Rwanda and Uganda. And those are countries that have been right on the edge of the Ebola crisis in the DRC. So they had a lot of procedures in place that they rolled out for COVID instead of Ebola. One of those procedures was an immediate lockdown across the country. And I mean a lockdown with curfews in the evening, to the level that people were actually being shot if they were outside the curfews in some of those countries. And that led to immediate shutdown of schools, but it also led to immediate shutdown of food supply. And so we had people in the areas that we were working with, within 3 days, were moving into fairly acute hunger because they lived from meal to meal. We've got kids now who've been out of school for a year. They've tried to get them back, but it hasn't worked. There's been increased dropout. It's very hard when you're working in countries where possibly the major source of food for a child in many areas is actually the nutritious food that they get at school. So there are numerous impacts that happen as a breakdown of this food supply chain. So closing schools affected that nutrition because many schools had school feeding programs that were the only potential source of a decent meal every day. A lot of those who were sent home will never actually get back to school, as they'll move on to jobs to help with family income as they try and dig out of the debt that's been caused, or perhaps it's early marriage. Young women are married off early because they're seen as a burden in some of these countries. And with so many poor under increasing stress due to the loss of income, loss of schools times, rising prices, fears and uncertainties, as you can imagine, there's also been a rise in gender-based violence. And that's actually been proved to be true across the whole world, not just the majority world. We've seen that in places like Canada and the UK as well, according to latest statistics. But in countries that, again, don't have some of the protections that we have here, we've seen gender-based violence rise quite significantly. COVID isn't the only problem people are facing in the developing countries. It's exacerbated inequalities and vulnerabilities that were already present. In fact, surveys conducted in 23 countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas late in 2020 show the impact of COVID on food income and family well-being. As you can see from the statistics there, 44% of food quality and quantity has decreased. 90% of incomes have decreased. 2/3 had to borrow money or buy on credit or ask family neighbors for financial help. 33% of family health and well-being is worse, and 70% more conflict has been reported in families and communities. So what have we learned? Well, in the short term, the response of Canadian Foodgrains Bank has been that we're trying to do what we can in order to allow people to practice our work in safety. We've seen modified food assistance programs to reduce contact and risk. We've tried to set up some of the same COVID protocols that we've set up here. We've seen smaller gatherings and gatherings happening less often, which is a problem for our work because a lot of our work happens in support groups. It happens in economic microloan processes. It happens in women's capacity building groups. We've seen increased use of remote tools for agriculture extension, phone, text, and radio. But again, that relies on people having access to phone, text, and radios, which isn't always the case in the places where we work. In the medium term, we've been very engaged in actually providing programs that can really help in terms of the situations that people have had. We've come alongside the Canadian government. As you know, the Canadian government is a big supporter of Foodgrains Bank with the match funding that we have on a regular basis. But the government has also offered funds that we've been able to take advantage for some short-term 18-month-long programs. There are 2 programs we're running at the moment across the world. One is what we call our emergency conservation agriculture extension. And that's assisting farming with training, farmers with training, inputs, finances and markets, work that we can do with organizations across the world, such as PWRDF. And that has been in 5 countries in Africa that we've really focused on there. And so we've really been able to come alongside some of those farmers and really help them to deal with some of these food supply breakdown situations. We're just about to start a new $10 million program, again, funded by the Canadian government, for food assistance for vulnerable people. And this will work in both humanitarian relief, the emergency situations we're in, and really helping them to adapt to long-term development as well. Training and inputs for farmers and non-agricultural livelihoods will happen after we've given food assistance to vulnerable people. We'll be working on building community assets. We'll be working to work with women and also young people as we have gender equality training that's built into this program as well. So in the terms of what we're seeing and dealing with, it's reckoned that approximately 100 to 200 million, and the figures are still very woolly as we assess the impact, but the World Food Programme is assessing in those kind of regions of numbers of people that will fall further into hunger. And we will be needing to deal with that for decades while we wrestle in Canada with whether or not we have enough vaccines. And as you'll have seen in reputable sources, we've actually ordered 10 more than we need. We're just struggling to get them at the moment. We work in countries that have no access and can't even order. They don't have the funds for it. And the majority and the richer countries are scrapping over what's there. There is a need for vaccine justice, not just vaccine nationalism. But there's also a need for us to think through what happens next as a result of this pandemic, because the economics impacts, the tail of this pandemic will be long lasting. Development gains over decades for those living in poverty, for those that are struggling to find gender equality, are rapidly being eroded. We have seen so many people move out of poverty over the last 10 years, and we've started to see those being turned around as we deal with more barriers to overseas development aid around the world. So we've learned that the economic impacts will be long lasting. We've learned that the development gains over decades are being eroded, but we've also learned something good. There is a word called localization. What that means is moving the center of gravity of our work from here in Canada or America or in a developed country to moving that center of gravity to the people in the countries themselves that actually know their own situations, that know their own abilities, that have their own assets that we can build on. So localization, taking our international work and really putting that center of gravity in the countries that need it, we've found that that works because we've not been able to travel like we had before. We haven't had the same levels of accountability in terms of like, well, in terms of giving people direction. We've had accountability in terms of communication and being able to see that the finance we're supplying has worked, and it has. Localization works. Local partners have the capacity to quickly adapt, and they continue delivering services. We sometimes found out about some of those adaptations after people had moved in emergency to make them happen, and they were good. We've also learned something. At the beginning of this pandemic, we forecast that our funding would actually drop, but actually our funding has risen because Canadians are generous. We found that people really have realized, especially in the areas of health and food security, that what we have in Canada is not what people have around the world, and that every human being is valuable in the sight of God, and that we are all equal. There are no others. There's just us. If one person's hurting, we're all hurting. And we had seen that worked out in the way that Canadians have been generous to those around the world, which is something I am actually deeply proud of. We've also recognized at Canadian Foodgrains Bank that Global Affairs Canada, the arm of the government that looks after our overseas development initiatives, recognizes our expertise. We've had deep conversations at deep levels with senior members of GAC to say, how can we work together to really address some of these food supply issues? That's why they've been so generous in providing that funding. And they've also approached us to design some very innovative funding mechanisms and program mechanisms that are going to integrate humanitarian, which is the initial response to crisis, with development work, which is the longer response to how do we build sustainability. Often those two things work in silos. Some of the programs we're working on now are really integrating those things and allowing us to think through how can we change the very face of development to guard against this kind of thing in the future. As we go forward, I want to close by just telling you a very brief story of something I saw. When I was in Rwanda in March of last year, I visited a school just as that school was being closed down. I saw those very smallholder farmers that were built around the school. And I saw those people who were looking to us, the organization I was in, to move from education very quickly to helping them with crops and food supply. So as we took a look at what was happening around the world and around that region, the organization I was in shifted very quickly to something we didn't know very well, which was food security issues. What we did was we stood back and we actually allowed local people to tell us what was needed. This is that localization debate. We were stunned at the knowledge, the capacity, the assets they had, and it actually taught us a lesson that we don't know as much as we think we know. So one of the things we're looking to do is we work with the Canadian government, because the Canadian government is also recognizing this. And as we work with Canadians, is to help people recognize through this pandemic, well, number one, we are all in this together. One's hurting, we're all hurting. The pandemic, the COVID virus knows no borders. And so as we come together in the world, it's to recognize that we're in this together. And number two is to recognize that we're perhaps not as clever as we think we are sometimes, and that others know more than we do. And so our hope is that as we go forward, first of all, Canada will increase its overseas development assistance, recognizing the needs that are out there. But secondly, we'll be able to do this in unity. And that all of us together will be able to come alongside and meet those needs of people who are created in God's image, just like us. That there will be a world without hunger. And we have hope for that. And we'll be able to do that together.
Thank you, Andy, for that. And before we do move on from you, I wanted to just, I guess, kind of pull out some of the points that stood out to me from your presentation and ask a follow-up. So some of the numbers that you shared are staggering, quite frankly. So you mentioned something along the lines of 1.5 billion students that have lost access to school. And as you note, many of those students probably won't have the opportunity to go back and continue their learning when this is all said and done. And you also spoke about how COVID obviously has had an impact on food security, but that impact specifically on food security has exacerbated challenges. And you touched a bit on gender-based violence and early marriage and some of the broader societal challenges that are at play here. To me, it really drives home the point that food security is about more than just food in people's bellies. And I'm wondering if you can speak just a little bit about, I guess, kind of the connection between food security and really the social determinants of health.
Absolutely. In two ways, actually. First of all, in terms of food security, you can take it as a wider than even just health and food security. In the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 2 is food security. It's a world without hunger. And the reason why it's so early is that if you don't have food, if you don't have the ability to eat, so many of the other things we want to see happen as we reduce poverty really fall apart. It's very hard to have an education system where kids are hungry. I once actually watched a child fall over in a playground because they hadn't eaten for 7 days on their way to a math lesson. How's someone going to learn good math when that's happening? It's hard to have good health systems if you don't have food security, because nutrition is such a key part of health. It's if you don't have food security, even though you may have good clean water and health and hygiene as a result of that, you're really going to be damaging people's internal health if you don't have the ability to give them nutritious food. So food security is very much at the heart of this. Again, without food security, all sorts of tensions arise. It's one of the reasons why we've seen some of the gender-based violence that's occurred alongside the lockdown as well. So it brings all sorts of stress. It's very hard. If any of you have ever experienced severe hunger, it's very hard to concentrate on any of the other things that we have if we don't have the ability to eat well. Now, I guess the final point to your question as well is that the economic aspects of the pandemic, as well as the health aspects of the pandemic, are bringing this long tail of problems that will cause aspects in so much of the poverty reduction we're doing around the world. And we'll dig into that if we don't deal with the food security issues and the supply chain issues that have caused that to happen as well, Mike.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. And one last thing before we move on. At the outset, I neglected to mention or ask that a number of folks who have joined us today may not be familiar with CFGB or Canadian Foodgrains Bank. So you are an organization that pulls together other organizations and faith-based groups across Canada that do the partnership work with communities on the ground in these different contexts. So I'm wondering if you can just speak very briefly a little bit about how CFGB works in general.
Yes, sure. I'd love to, actually. So we are a partnership of these 15 member agencies, of which PWRDF is one. And they're all basically the development agencies of Christian denominations or Christian member agencies that come together. We're very much supported across the country by Canadians. We have a particular base into rural Canada. A lot of farmers and farm communities come behind Canadian Foodgrains Bank. With that, the money we're able to generate from that and from donations across the country, and you can donate to the member agencies through our work as well, is matched by the government for humanitarian relief on a 4-to-1 basis, and for longer term agricultural development on a 3-to-1 basis. And so our partners share that pot of money. We have all sorts of complex formulas. But they develop programs along with, our members rather, develop programs along with their partners on the ground. CFGB's job is to oversee that in terms of giving technical expertise, monitoring and evaluation, sourcing that funding and really ensuring that we do a good job, the best job we can. We're actually a top 10 impact charity in Canada as part of that, but we rely on Canadians and on our members coming together to say, we must come alongside those who don't have what we have. We must trust them, work with them, and develop programs where we can see not just short-term relief, but longer-term development, that we might see a world without hunger, which is our aim as a Christian response. We want to see a world without hunger.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Andy. Very much appreciated. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Kevin Munini Kamuya, who is the CEO of the Utooni Development Organization. Kevin is joining us today from Machakos in Kenya. And Kevin has a lifelong interest in community development with a focus on changing lives. He holds a master's degree in project planning and management from the University of Nairobi and has been working with rural communities in Kenya for 10 years, 8 with UDO, enabling them to improve water supply, food production, income, and health. And in 2014, Kevin received the UNDP Equator Initiative Award on behalf of the Utooni Development Organization for promoting sustainable land management practices. And in 2015, he was accredited to the United Nations Convention for Combating Desertification, observer status. So with any further ado, I'd like to pass things over to Kevin. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Andy, for giving me this opportunity to do my presentation. My name is Kevin Munini Kamuya, and I work at Utooni Development Organization as the program manager. And as Andy had already introduced me, I won't dwell much on my profile. I will just go straight to complementing what Andy has just presented. I want to echo his sentiments that he has shared as a partner. CFGB has worked with Utooni Development Organization for quite a long time. And around 3 years ago, we also started working with Primates World Relief Development Fund in a new project where we are helping community members to improve water security by digging shallow wells. I would like also to compliment Andy for our efforts and recognize for the efforts that are being recognized by the government. That is the work that CFGB is doing with its partner all over the world. My name is Kevin Munini Kamuya, and I want to do my presentation right now. And I serve as the program manager at Utooni Development Organization, and I'm very happy to join you today from Kenya, here in East Africa. Give me the next slide, Janice. So our mission is to enable communities to improve water supply, food production, and income and health among rural communities here in Kenya. And we partner with several partners in Canada, local partners here in Kenya, and also some in other countries all over the world. But I would like to mention a few who we've been doing big projects with for quite a long time, and that is Canadian Foodgrains Bank, Mennonite Central Committee, among other donors. There is one other representative from Sahakarini. I've seen him join us today. They also fund Sundams with the Utooni Development Organization. And the purpose of our project is to implement agriculture and livelihood projects for communities suffering from hunger, food insecurity, water insecurity, and also communities who are whose livelihoods are largely affected by climatic, economic, or environmental factors. Next slide, please. I would like to go to the challenges caused by COVID-19. I know Andy has talked much about what CFGB has seen or maybe has experienced since COVID-19 came around. And I would like to share the challenges that have been caused by narrowing down to our community here in Kenya. First, I'd like to say in East Africa, COVID-19 came on a year that began with heavy unexpected rains out of season, followed by swarms of locusts. I think most of you heard about locusts here in East Africa. And food security was already looming before even COVID-19 arrived here in Kenya. The first case of COVID-19 was reported in early March. And you can see we were coming from one challenge going to another, and the year was just started at a very, very low note. Compared to a normal period of food insecure households in Kenya, food insecurity increased by 38% between March and April 2020. That is according to a research that was recently done by Science Direct early in January 2021. So you can see that's a huge difference when it comes to food security amongst the households that you're working with here in Kenya. Another thing that I'll say with regard to challenges, it's not very different from what Andy has just presented. I think it's because we've been working with them for quite a long time. That's why most of our points are almost similar. But one thing I realize is that Andy is really referring to Rwanda. Rwanda and Kenya, they are not far away from each other. So mostly the situation would be, or the condition would be mostly similar. Business stocks assets shrunk amongst community members who operate small businesses. And until now, most small businesses are running at a loss. We've seen small businesses closing up. Others don't have capitals to continue running. Others cannot afford the rent they are supposed to pay on a monthly basis. The other point that I want to raise with regard to challenges is the experts say the real tally of COVID-19 mortality cases are much higher due to inadequate testing and a policy of only counting hospital deaths. So this point is related to food security, because the age gap is really affected by 19 is from 55 years and above, and most of these people are not reporting to hospital, and we are seeing sudden deaths that are happening. Last week we had 2 burials of people within that age gap, and it keeps rising every month. So it's a serious problem that really needs to be looked at. Most of the cases are not being reported to the hospital. Most of the victims are not going to hospital, they are dying at home. Next slide, please, Janice. I will continue with the challenges that are coming about as a result of COVID-19. According to the United Nations, you said more than 70% of the rural population depends on agriculture for their livelihoods here in Africa. And so you see 70% of the rural population depends on agriculture for their livelihoods here in Africa. When COVID-19 came around, and it's affecting the age group above 55 years and above. Those are the people who are being affected by COVID-19. And those are the main farmers here in Africa. They're the people who own farms. Most of the youth here in Africa or Kenya, they like to move from the rural areas to the urban areas to look for labor, or maybe to look for formal employment. So this is the population that is being highly affected by COVID-19. And many Kenyan rural urban households depend on public spaces like markets and movement to make ends meet. So people must move here in Kenya to make ends meet, or maybe to sustain their livelihoods. Community projects, which is seasonal agriculture work and traveling to markets to sell or buy products or farm inputs, are some of their livelihood activities. When restrictions are implemented that require reduced mobility, many people abruptly lose their source of livelihood. It goes without saying that if people cannot move, they cannot access inputs, they cannot access food in the markets, then most of them will lose their livelihoods. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I would like to talk about opportunities and working differently in these times of COVID-19. Food spending remained at pre-COVID levels. School and transport spending decreased, thus households could spend savings to do other development activities at home. The government restrictions or regulations of staying home and the schools being closed enabled households to save some money, which could be used to do other development activities at home, like buying farm inputs for those who could access them, and others will buy water harvesting equipment or even farm tools. So there was some saving at household level. And to cope with lower cash inflows, households reduced their social support to others. This is not very good. Households learned to save resources and to live within their limits. So there was less support coming from one household to the other because of the government regulations of staying at home and maintaining social distance. You would find that most households who are not food insecure are really suffering very much because they are not getting a lot of support from their neighbors or even sometimes from their family members, because everybody is afraid of their food stocks getting finished. Farmer savings and credit associations and cooperatives have reported high recruitment of new members who want credit in order to venture into full-time agriculture. Because of urban to rural migration, there were lots of people who lost employment in the urban areas, and as they go back to the rural areas, they are looking at a starting point on how they are going to manage their day-to-day activities, where they're going to get their daily food, where they're going to get some income to pay school fees, maybe for their children, because they don't have an employment now. So we are seeing very many community members recruiting in these farmer savings and credit associations. Because of very high urban to rural migration, we've seen that these farmer savings and credit associations have been recruiting new members at a very high rate currently, because people lost their livelihoods, others lost their formal employment and moved from the urban centers to the rural centers, and now they are trying to look at how they are going to start their lives in the rural areas. And some of them are joining these associations or loaning association or cooperatives for the purpose of accessing credit or loans, at least to sustain themselves. Still on opportunities and working differently, I would like to do my presentation on that. And I'd like to talk about urban to rural migration and working from home regulation, increased food production in the rural areas. The fact that many people move from the urban areas to the rural areas of Kenya, this made them to have a lot of time back in the rural areas. And the only thing that people could do was food production. So we could see households moving from Nairobi, moving to other big cities, to their rural areas. And the rural areas, because they have to maintain social distancing, they have to stay indoors. The only thing they could engage themselves in was agriculture, and that increased the food production in the rural areas of Kenya. But it takes time for food to come from the farm. So right now we are seeing the effects of these households moving from the urban centers to the rural areas. And the price of land in rural Kenya surged high because of the large number of unemployed community members who are looking for bigger spaces to produce food and engage in other income generating activities. I would like to back this point by saying that when a husband loses his formal employment, or maybe both spouses lose employment and they have to go to the rural areas, there is no other way they could improve their livelihoods except by engaging in farming activities. And some of them, because they have small sizes of land, they came with a little savings and now they wanted to expand their sizes of land. And so the people in the rural areas, when they saw everybody coming from the cities, also the price of land went up. There was also a change in mindset. There is change in mindset where community members have realized that it's risky to rely on one livelihood activity, whereby now community members are integrating different livelihood activities at household level. You go to a household, you find that they are doing poultry keeping. They are also doing, can you get me, please? I can see my internet connection going low. Can you get me?
I think we can hear you, Kevin, yes.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Where the change of mindset, where community members have realized that it's risky and they're engaging in different livelihood activities. You find a household engaging in poultry keeping, goat keeping, they are doing kitchen garden, they're also planting cereals, and there is a diversity in the number of activities that households are engaging themselves in right now, unlike before COVID. The other point that I want to raise is that as families stayed home, most of them adopted family farming as a livelihood activity. Farm work is shared amongst family members. This was not happening very much before COVID, but when family members had to stay home, family heads could not go home. They were working from home. The children were not going to school. It created a culture of the family working together. And this really improved the cohesion among us family members in doing development work at household level. Let's go to the next slide. I would like to talk about food insecurity. And these are some of the factors that are leading to food insecurity during this time of COVID-19. Lack of farm inputs because of reduced income at household level. You will find that many households lost their livelihoods when COVID-19 was reported here in Kenya. And they could not actually access farm inputs because of that. Some could not afford to buy farm tools, some could not afford to buy seeds, some could not even afford decent or safe storage facilities. That is the bags that you use to store cereals or maybe food crops after drying. So those are some of the challenges that community members faced after COVID-19 was reported here in Kenya in March. Lack of external support for rural farmers at local, national, and international organizations focusing on COVID-19. There was a lot of diversion by many organizations, even the government, towards COVID-19, fighting COVID-19, and everybody now is talking about vaccines. Nobody's talking about food security. So these are some of the challenges where you find the farmers, it's like they're not getting adequate resources for them to build themselves as much as we need to improve food security. There was high unemployment rates which have increased population in the rural households, thus depleting food sources as unemployed family members move from urban centers with no money or food. So you find in a household where maybe the parents are retired, and maybe they have five children who are working maybe in the cities. Maybe 3 of them are working in the city, and maybe 2 of them are only remaining in the household going to school. And then all of a sudden, the 3 children who are working in the urban areas, they lose their employment and they go and rejoin their parents in the household. The parents are not prepared to live with these other 3 children. And so food sources get depleted very fast. And you find that this brings some kind of food crisis in the household because of the unforeseen migration of family members from urban centers to the rural areas. The other point that I'd like to raise is most rural farmers are above 55 years. I think I talked about this. The age that is highly threatened by COVID-19. Most farmers in this age group have stopped participating in community work and attending trainings. Mortality rates are also high, as I had said earlier on, and this is the farming age gap. These are the people we call farmers here in Eastern Kenya, or even in most areas in Kenya. These are the people who own the larger farms. These are the people who are left behind when children go. They fly out of the nest. These are the parents who are left back in the rural areas doing farming activities. And according to our population, we as Utooni Development Organization, we have been working almost 60% of our target population is 50 years and above. And that is the same population that is being said is highly threatened by COVID-19. The next. So with regard to food security, most farmers are not allowing visitors in their farms, and that's also a challenge that we are facing. And the other point is the difficulties caused by COVID-19. We are seeing lots of cases of mental illnesses, and others, mostly youth, turning to drugs and prostitution, and increased domestic violence at household level. So these are some of the other effects of COVID-19. And this really affects food production and income generation activities at household level. Let's move on. I would like to go to lessons learned. Janice, please. I would like to say talk about the economic, environmental, and social health systems can serve our needs and purposes. And it is obvious from data collected by government and other organizations that food insecurity has worsened during the period of the pandemic compared to a normal period. So we are affirming that food security is really has been really affected because of the effects of COVID-19. The other point is pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates to us the value of freedom and the freedom to move and to be with those we love, to live in dignity and in good health. something that we never thought was quite important, and community members are really appreciating this. Then they really miss the past days where they could interact. There was no social distancing, and there was no stay-at-home orders and things like that. Africa needs to be resilient to what we cannot change and efficient in our development strategies by building our strengths and addressing our weaknesses as we address challenges caused by COVID-19. Let's go next to the next slide, please. I would like to show you a few photos of the activities that we are doing currently as I finish my presentation. This is we are trained community members on climate smart agriculture and integration of livestock so that they can build their resilience against the effects of COVID-19. Let's go to the next one. Next. We are also supporting community members with seeds, mostly for those vulnerable community members living in arsal areas, that is arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya. Next. We are also supporting female-aided or widows with poultry to improve the breeds that they are currently keeping at home. These poultry breeds, they produce they mature at a shorter in a shorter period, and they're also to produce much more eggs than the other breeds that the community currently keeps.
Just before we move on to Dr. Aboom, I just very briefly, what I appreciate about what you're sharing is the resiliency, that grassroots resiliency that's coming through, and the solutions that are coming up on a grassroots level, and it's encouraging to see. So thank you for really bringing that out in your presentation. So
thank you.
Well noted. So we'll move on now to our third speaker, who is Dr. Agnes Aboom, who is the Central Committee Moderator for the World Council of Churches. Dr. Aboom is an African laywoman, an accomplished development consultant, a committed peace builder, and a gender and human rights advocate. And she has a wealth of knowledge and experience in ecumenical community work and peace building in Africa, South America, North America, Europe, the United Kingdom, and Australia. In 2013, she was elected as the World Council of Churches Central Committee Moderator, the first woman and the first African to hold that position. And Dr. Aboom is joining us today from Nairobi. Dr. Aboom, over to you.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to this International Development Week with such a critical theme of our times. May I begin by appreciating the Anglican Church, and particularly the Primates World Relief and Development Fund that I had an opportunity to work with, but also the member churches of Canada for their very strong commitment to the World Council of Churches and other faith communities. I'll be sharing with you some of the ideas that our colleagues in Geneva who work on health and food security have actually provided. My approach is going to be give a few statistics on the global context, raise a few of the thematic areas and what the faith communities and churches are doing, and then look at the lessons we have learned along the way. I want to appreciate this panel, and I want to thank Andy and Kevin for really raising critical issues of our day at different levels. In 2019, it was estimated that 690 million people were hungry and chronically malnourished. In the last 5 years, we see that 2 billion individuals suffer micronutrient deficiencies, with rapidly rising overconsumption, notably of unhealthy foods. Globally, therefore, 1 in 5 deaths, equivalent to 11 million deaths, is associated with poor diet. Diet also contributes to a range of chronic diseases in people worldwide. The pandemic has added another layer of difficulty to many interconnected factors negatively influencing food security, adding another 130 million people hungry. Over 1 year into the COVID pandemic, with over 100 million cases reported worldwide, and with over 2.3 million lives lost due to the disease. The situation regarding access to food and people's livelihood has significantly worsened. The pandemic has in fact exposed and exacerbated the vulnerabilities that communities are facing and has worsened the falling food systems. But this crisis clearly shows us that the causes of food insecurity are multifaceted and multi-connected. It also reveals the fundamental systemic flaws of our dealings with each other and with nature. Once again, faith communities are in the forefront, responding holistically, which may be the only sustainable way forward. We are also witnessing solidarity and hope in times of the pandemic. Now, how about the work, economy, and food security situation? We are witnessing unprecedented suffering in all our communities, with informal sector labor workers who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic. It is estimated that 60% of this labor worldwide is actually lost its jobs, and in Africa, 80%. The recent severe humanitarian crisis in southern Madagascar, caused by drought and the pandemic affecting 35% of the region's population, is a stark reminder of this nexus. The COVID pandemic has caused the disappearance of income-related seasonal employment, in which many families relied to get through the lean season, which peaks between January and April. It is also estimated that an additional 140 million people descended into living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 per day. How have the churches and faith communities contributed? Churches have been in the forefront, supporting the most vulnerable communities with food, accompaniment, and protection of hundreds of thousands of people in need. They have also actively highlighted the bigger picture, advocating for economic justice in the times of COVID-19 to overcome poverty, inequality, and impoverishment. Even in the wealthiest countries, churches all over the world have been supporting communities who are out of work and experiencing hunger through food banks and kitchen soups. In Ghana, for instance, individuals and corporate organizations have teamed up with churches to distribute food to the poor living in the margins. In South Africa, churches are working with the government to distribute food vouchers and coordinate the safe and secure delivery of food parcels to people in need. In Jordan, a local church teamed up with neighborhood shopkeepers to put together food parcels for vulnerable refugees. In India and Pakistan, the churches provided food parcels and supplies to migrant workers and poor members of society. Cases after cases are reported by faith communities and churches. Churches advocated for an economy of life and continue to advocate for an economy of life and for the cancellation of debts as a way forward in these difficult times in order to improve livelihoods and sustenance. Climate change and food security. Climate change continues relentlessly. One of the 3 warmest years on record is actually 2020. And between 2011 and 2020 will be the warmest decade on record, with the warmest 6 years all being since 2015. Ocean heat is at the record levels. More than 80% of the global ocean experienced marine heat waves at some time in 2020, with widespread repercussions for marine ecosystems already suffering from more acidic waters due to carbon dioxide absorption. There were increased occurrences of high impact events, including extreme heat, wildfires, floods, and record-breaking hurricanes affecting millions of people, compounding threat to human health, food security, and economic stability. Despite the COVID-19 lockdown, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases continue to rise, committing the planet to further warming for many generations to come because of the long time of CO2 in the atmosphere. Latest climate model projections show potentials for higher temperature increase, ensuring more negative effects on agriculture. The wealthier one is the greater one's impact on the environment. The world's richest 10% produces half of the carbon emissions, while the most impoverished 3.5 billion account for just a tenth. However, it is the poorest and the most vulnerable who suffer the most due to climate change. Therefore, global warming is an ethical, moral, and political issue rather than purely environmental or physical. Climate change is a matter of justice. Climate change is a matter of life and death because of its impact on food security. How have the churches and communities been responding? The ecumenical movement and faith communities have been united in calling for fair and just policies that are able to tackle climate emergency in the light of COVID. Food and the environment. 40% of the Earth's land surface is for food production. Agriculture also makes use of 70% of all available water resources. Agriculture contributes about 1/5 of the greenhouse gas emissions. Our quest for food on an industrial scale is a primary cause of biodiversity loss, including the collapse of major marine fisheries and freshwater ecosystems. 80% of contamination of freshwater and coastal ecosystems by excess nutrient runoff and chemical pesticides. The increasing dependence on industrial crop and livestock production rather than diversified agroecological farming contributes to these severe consequences. Smallholders, peasants, indigenous communities, and artisan fisherfolk represent the most impoverished communities in society. They are pushed to the margins of society by a market-driven world. Their living knowledge and experience are crucial for the world's survival in an age facing climate change. They remain closest to the earth and are the guardians of the world's biodiversity and of our hope to help us adapt and flourish in a changing environment. Faith communities are actively engaged in the grassroots, promoting farming which transforms food and agriculture to be more resilient, equitable, inclusive, environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. The work of the Organization of African Instituted Churches, OIC, Farmer to Farmer Interactive Program is a good example. We need to shift from industrial modes of agriculture to systems based around more diversified agroecological farming for a sustainable world. It is also vital that the overall sustainable environment and ecological concerns are promoted at the community level. Some of the significant interventions that faith communities and churches are engaged in are like, for example, Season for Creation, Green Anglican Movement, Green Church Initiative in Denmark, the Eco Church, a Rock UK project run in partnership with Christian Aid, the Church of England, and the Methodist Church and Tear Fund. We have so many of these initiatives, both in the North and in the South. For example, the Green Church program in Canada, Greening Congregations program on the Earth Ministry, Church of South India's work on ecological concerns, Evangelical Lutheran Church of Tanzania, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and so forth and so on. Andy did mention something on children and the impact of COVID and their vulnerability. I'd like to raise this issue once again and state that as for us in the World Council of Churches, children has been a major issue, and COVID right now has threatened their food security. In several ways, we have about 1.3 billion children who are out of school and miss on their meals, and therefore access to nutritious food and health support. The confinement has also made children more vulnerable to violence and abuse. What are churches and faith communities doing with these children? Many have been engaged in ensuring that food distribution is available, safety of children is provided, and so forth and so on. As I come towards the closure of my presentation, I'd like to mention something on COVID-19 to the environment, health, and food. COVID-19 is the latest of several recent zoonotic diseases emerging in people, demonstrating how human health and nature are closely interconnected. A zoonotic disease is a disease that can be transmitted from animals to people, or more specifically, a disease that usually exists in animals, but that can affect humans. Over the last 30 years, approximately 60 to 70% of the new diseases that emerged in humans had a zoonotic origin. Approximately 3 to 4 new infectious diseases emerge each year, most of which originate from wildlife. Climate change, destruction of wild habitats, and trading in wild animals all increase interactions with nature that can expose people to a wide range of animal diseases. Looking forward, with regards to COVID-19 health and food security, it is vital that people all over the world have equitable access to vaccines. Only a rapid coverage of all communities in the world can effectively stop the pandemic and help the recovery of the livelihoods and economies. This is a moral and ethical issue and a matter of people's human rights and dignity. But the public health aspects need to be highlighted too if the current trends continue, with wealthy nations taking up most of the vaccines, depriving the majority of the world population. The pandemic will continue to rage on. The virus will continue to mutate and change, making the current vaccines less effective in their protective ability. Therefore, to address some of this, a joint statement by the World Council of Churches and the World Jewish Congress inviting religious leaders to reflect, engage on ethical issues related to global vaccine has been sent out, and we hope that most other communities and NGOs and INGOs will participate. What are some of the lessons that we in the World Council of Churches are learning, have learned, and will continue to learn? We hope we can learn and not just learn and hope that we will be a one community. It is going to be a struggle. One is that food security is multifaceted and interconnected, and responding holistically is the only sustainable way towards faith communities as they are best placed to serve, accompany, and to, as faith communities are best placed to serve, to accompany, and to champion for communities. This has been evidently proven during the COVID period. Second, it is vital that to address the issue of food security in the context of COVID-19, we ensure a sustainable recovery of livelihood and health of communities. WCC's holistic response is a good example of equipping and responding to the needs of the people. 3, it is essential that the majority of the people in the world who follow a particular faith are able to see these vital and existential issues through the lens of their faith, guided by ethical and moral values. Such an approach can truly and deeply mobilize communities to meaningful and sustainable action. 4, the people who are in the margins of society and who are going through the greatest challenges are also the source of many of the solutions. With their agency and God-given dignity and capacity, vulnerable communities cannot be viewed and treated as mere recipients of support and humanitarian assistance, but rather as partners in action with people and organizations which hold power and resources. The experiences and the wisdom of the people on the ground should be channeled to the highest decision-making bodies, such as the upcoming United Nations 2021 food security. And I think Kevin has eloquently highlighted this. We have the WCC campaign, Food for Life, which is being taken to the UN. It is therefore for us, and I want to really thank this panel for raising pertinent issues. But brothers and sisters, we are on a pilgrimage, and we either stop and actually change the course from just talking and really recognize, as Andy said, we will either all perish or we will all survive if we act together with one common vision and purpose. Therefore, it is time to act. It is time to speak. It is time to engage all stakeholders for the sake of humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Aboom, for that very stirring conclusion and call to action. What strikes me about what you were saying, just you used the word multifaceted and interconnected, and I think that your presentation really drove how very true that is in terms of these issues that we're facing, and how our approach needs to be holistic in addressing them collectively. So thank you for pulling that out. We're going to transition now to a time of questions and answers. So to kick us off, I want to go back to a question that was raised a little earlier specifically about vaccine justice. And I think there was a little back and forth in the chat, and Andy, you maybe addressed this question in the chat. But I'm wondering if you can just speak to for the benefit of those that didn't see a little bit about how if CFGB is involved in advocacy with regards to vaccine support and distribution, and ensuring that that progresses in an equitable way.
Thanks very much, Mike. Well, the answer is yes, but with the caveat that Canadian Foodgrains Bank, our expertise is in food security. Now, as we've seen, this whole pandemic has a long tail and has a great impact on food security. So to the level that it has been, that's where we've engaged. Our expertise is really in trying to help those in countries that are really struggling as a regard to this. And so our primary response has been to work with the government to liberate more funds and to help gather funds from Canadians in order to actually work with people like Kevin on the ground to do the responses that he's talked about. However, we do have an advocacy department, and that issue has come up on numerous occasions in many meetings we've had recently. And because it does, we believe, impact food security, the lack of vaccine and the lack of equity in terms of that, and inclusion in terms of that across the majority world, means that we're going to have a longer tail. So we have raised that issue. Or actually, perhaps a better way of putting that is we supported those who've raised that issue in numerous meetings, because it is a crucial part of this story. So we're not a medical organization. We don't have the ability to be involved in the actual rollout of that, but we do have some agency in terms of speaking into it, and we have stood with those very firmly that really understand that this is an issue that has a much wider context than the medical side.
Excellent, thank you for that. Another question that's come up is, what is the impact of corporate interest with regard to achieving agricultural sustainability and food security? And have these interests shifted in the past year, either in a negative or a positive direction? Dr. Aboum, I'm wondering if that's something that you might speak to.
Definitely the major industrial seed companies, technology are very critical. And to some extent, we as faith communities, we've raised issues, but we've not really engaged with in a creative way in terms of really bringing to the table critical data, alternatives. And when you do that, you need to also engage with the given government, because they work in league with governments and with the local companies. It is one of the areas that we hope we can actually bring it to these UN food security platforms, because it is them that are contributing to the diminishing biodiversity. It is them that are not allowing for a diversified approach to food production. The seeds so it's a complex issue, but we have NGOs or resource organizations that are supporting churches in terms of how to engage with specific areas of these corporate entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aboum. We have a question that is specifically directed to Kevin. Kevin, are you seeing any structural changes in terms of the East Africa economy post-pandemic? I.e., sorry, I just lost that question there. Are there any imports or exports that may not resume post-pandemic?
Oh, thank you very much, Mike. Notably, all supply chains were disrupted by the crisis, with some Kenyan exports like tea and fruit surpassing levels of years past, because these are foods that are exported to the Western world. That was not largely affected. We are even seeing now passenger aircrafts being converted to cargo aircrafts to carry commodities to export commodities to abroad. Therefore, say rather, imports have been the principal victim of the crisis, declining by a quarter over the past months, because most people, most companies here cannot afford to import. There is no sustainable income. There are no customers for most products that were coming from abroad because of reduced incomes. But generally, the exports have not been highly affected. They are still going out of the country. And mostly these have to do with tea, fruit, and other food commodities.
Okay, thank you for that, Kevin. There was another question that had come up earlier that I'm just scrolling back to now, and I think either Kevin or Dr. Aboum could perhaps answer this one. Can either of you expand on the migration that we've seen from urban centers to rural centers, and what types of jobs specifically are we seeing that were lost in these urban areas?
Thank you very much, Mike. I would like to answer that question. First, I'd like to refer to a few articles that have been written. The first one is Business Daily Africa, where they reported that between March 2020 and June 2020, 4.6 million jobs had been lost in Kenya, with young people being the hardest hit. These are people who are in the age gap of below 35 years. And I give you an example. I'd like to say 2.5 million jobs were lost in the tourism sector alone. To add on to that, there is also statistics from Federation of Kenyan Employers, that is FKE, that 604 companies in Kenya sent workers home due to COVID-19 fallout. And the worst is yet to come. That is what they are saying. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics indicates that 1.7 million employees have been redundant since COVID-19 was reported in Kenya. So this is the rate at which people are losing employment here in Kenya.
Let me just add, if you allow me, in in addition to the tourist industry, I think we also have the entire hospitality industry that is lost out. We also have the whole civil society sector, which of course did employ quite a few people, including churches. There you also have a loss of losses of employment. You have also the whole building, the construction industry. It is kind of slow. We are in a slow mode at the moment, and that is what employs a lot of casual labor or day labor. That means that all those jobs that are classified as informal have actually gone out. So it is across the sectors. Even government departments cannot really keep at pace with the rate of employment. So we are seeing a serious crisis in the whole labor. In terms of what might peak or not peak, yes, the export industry is there, flowers and company, but honestly speaking, when you have an economy, which most of the economies around here are highly indebted, there is no way they are going to manage. And the whole issue of debt should really be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for adding that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this one feels an appropriate place to end. And I'll invite all three of our speakers to speak to this one just very briefly at a high level. And we'll perhaps start with Andy and then go to Kevin and then finish with Dr. Aboom. This is obviously a very challenging time across the world and in many different contexts, and perhaps nowhere more than in the global South. But in the midst of this challenge, how should we stay encouraged and be hopeful? Andy, we can start with you.
Oh, what an amazingly good question, because I think that's the root of who we are. There, Romans 6:19 says we have this hope as an anchor for our soul. And I think for most of us on this call, if not all of us, we would recognize that God wants and desires to see a world without hunger. We would also recognize that one day, that hunger is going to be taken away, that there is going to be no more tears and no more crying. So we could, if we wanted to, just get lost in the pain of where we are now and step back and say, well, we're just leaving this all to you. You're going to come alongside us in a lifeboat one day and pull us out. But that's not what Scripture tells us. That's not who we're meant to be. Scripture is full of examples of people who had hope, and then they moved towards that hope. They didn't just sit around waiting, they moved towards that hope. And I think that's what we're called to do. There is a hope of a world without hunger one day in the kingdom mentality that we have. But there is also a hope today that we can be the outlying parts, the handprints and the footprints of that kingdom. So every single time we respond to a need, whether it's through COVID or whether it's through hunger or in whatever way, every single time we are moving towards the hope that God has for us. So we have to move towards that hope. And I believe that every single time we can picture someone, hear the stories of what Kevin is talking about on the field, listen to what Dr. Abu say in terms of us all being together, we are living out that hope of God. We are ambassadors of reconciliation. So we have to have hope. And we see that in the lives of people being changed. But without hope, what are we? So I believe in a better world to come, but I believe we can do our piece as outposts of the kingdom in this world, to be harbingers of hope and a sign of what is to come. There is hope. We would be nothing without it. We have it as an anchor for our soul.
Well said. Thank you, Andy, for that. Kevin, I'll invite you to share your thoughts on that same question.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer to Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, which says this: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you." So these are verses that I'm sharing with you. where God commands our confidence and trust in Him. In a world that encourages us to believe in ourselves and to achieve all we deserve, it's paramount to understand who and whose we are. And society sets a bar to earn and accumulate. And therefore, it's very important for accomplishments and accessories to be lauded above humility and God-ordained purposes. I would like to go back to my presentation and quote something that I shared under Lessons Learned, that Africa needs to be resilient to what we cannot change and efficient in our development strategies by building on our strengths and addressing our weaknesses as we address challenges caused by C-19. All is not lost. We have a lot of resources out there. We have a lot of opportunities that we can take. We can really work with, and therefore it's not very good for us as communities, as societies, as countries, as nations, as continents to only look at the negatives. It's very important for us to look left, right, and center and see what opportunities are there. What can we do best? How can we improve our livelihoods? How can we help each other during these difficult times? And I believe God is going to help us and get us through. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kevin. Thank you. Dr. Aboom, the final word goes to you.
Thank you so much. May I thank the two, particularly Kevin, you took words out of my mouth. Deuteronomy 31 verse 6. Wow, thank you. 3 points in my view. One is we cannot, as men and women of faith, who at a time the world now seems to turn to us for hope, for seeing a different perspective to life, we can't afford to lose that hope. We are a people of hope. We have to sustain hope. And the way to sustain hope is to hold one another, walk with each other, talk with each other, work with each other. And in that process, harness the small efforts of success. And they're there. The small innovations that we have had, those are the things that ignite hope, sustain hope, and enrich our journey. Let us share the courage of moving forward. Nothing is going to be permanent on this earth. It will pass. But when it passes, we should ask ourselves, was I a messenger of doom or was I a messenger of hope, of life? And I think this panel has illustrated there's a lot that people may not know, but which when shared, when we share our experiences, when we share our struggles and how we have come through, we will overcome. For indeed, we have one who already overcame death. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aboom. I don't think there's a better way to end it than with that. And that does bring us to a close of today's panel discussion. So I want to thank everyone for attending. In particular, I want to thank Andy and Kevin and Dr. Aboom for sharing their insights and their wisdom and their experience with us today. I think it's fascinating to me the ways in which all of our speakers have approached the topic of food security in the time of COVID-19 from both macro, micro, grassroots levels, have spoken to the interconnectedness of these issues, have spoken to how climate justice plays a role. And I think for me, one of my personal takeaways is just how closely knit all of these issues are, and to address one is to, by nature, by need, to address all. So thank you for making that point clear for us today. And thank you again to all three of you for making time to speak with us today. I just also want to very quickly thank the outstanding staff at Primates World Relief and Development Fund who make these types of learning opportunities possible for everyone. As a volunteer with the organization, I'm consistently amazed by the work that takes place, that our staff do to help to help amplify the voices of our partners and share the stories of people that are doing really important, meaningful work here close to home and across the globe. So thank you so much to staff, to Will and team for all that you do day in and day out, and especially in making these types of opportunities possible. And a final word just of thanks to all of the participants, those who came today and made a point of making time in your busy lives to be part of this discussion. And I think, you know, if I can be so bold to issue a challenge to all of us, I think it's, you know, how can we take the words of our panelists in our closing questions to heart? How can we be harbingers of hope, and how can we be messengers of hope in this unsettling time? And what are the actions that we can take, whether within our own contexts or whether in other contexts, to help address some of these issues of food security and inequality that have been further exacerbated by COVID-19? So that draws us to a close. Thank you very much for joining. Be well and God bless.